The next few days passed without much incident. I chalked up the weird noises to the apartment's old age. The building creaked and groaned with every gust of wind, every temperature change. I tried to convince myself it was all normal, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling that lingered since the first night. It wasn't until I met Claire, my neighbor, that things started to get a little better. She lived right across the hall from me, and we bumped into each other one morning as I was leaving for work. "Hey, you must be new," she said, flashing me a friendly smile. "Yeah, just moved in a couple of days ago," I replied, trying to sound more enthusiastic than I felt. She was in her early 30s, with short dark hair and a kind of casual, laid-back vibe. She wore an oversized sweater and jeans, holding a cup of coffee in one hand and her phone in the other. "I'm Claire. Been living here for a few years now," she said, her eyes scanning my face like she was sizing me up. "How are you liking it so far?" "It's nice," I said, but there must have been something in my tone because she raised an eyebrow. "You don't sound too sure about that." I shrugged, debating whether to bring up the footsteps and the weird feeling I had about the place. I didn't want to sound crazy. It's just, old buildings make a lot of noise, I guess. Claire smirked, like she knew exactly what I was talking about. "Yeah, they do. You get used to it, though. The first few nights can be a little unnerving, especially if you're not used to living alone." She didn't elaborate, but the way she said it made me think she knew more than she was letting on. I didn't push it. We made some small talk, and I found out she worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, which meant she was around the building most of the time. It was nice to know I had at least one friendly face nearby. After that, we exchanged numbers, and she invited me over for coffee later that week. That evening, after work, I decided to take Claire up on her offer. Her apartment was cozy, filled with plants and soft lighting. It was the kind of space that felt lived in, comfortable in a way that mine didn't yet. "So, how's it going? Any more creepy noises keeping you up?" she asked, sliding a cup of coffee across the table to me as we sat in her small living room. I hesitated, then decided to come clean. "Actually, yeah, I've been hearing footsteps at night, like right outside my door. It's kind of freaking me out." Claire didn't seem surprised. She took a sip of her coffee, then leaned back on the couch. "You're not the first person to mention that. The last guy who lived in your place, he had some stories." My stomach tightened a bit. "What do you mean?" "Well," Claire started, "I didn't know him super well, but we'd talk sometimes. His name was Dave, I think. Seemed like a nice guy, but after a few months, he started acting strange. He said he was hearing things at night, too. Footsteps, knocking, even whispers sometimes. At first, he thought it was just the building or maybe some noisy neighbors, but it got worse. He swore someone was messing with him. What happened to him?" Claire shrugged, looking a little uncomfortable. "One day, he just up and left. No notice, no goodbye. His apartment was empty overnight. I asked the landlord about it, and he just said Dave broke the lease and moved out suddenly." "But," she trailed off, staring into her coffee cup. "But what?" Claire sighed. "I don't know. It was weird. No one saw him leave, and he didn't take all his stuff. Just vanished. The landlord cleaned the place out after, and then it sat empty for a while until you moved in." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Do you think something happened to him?" Claire shook her head. "I don't know. I try not to think about it too much. This building is old, and people leave for all kinds of reasons. But there are some weird stories, I wasn't sure how to respond. On the one hand, I wanted to believe she was just telling me a spooky story for fun, something to mess with the new tenant. On the other hand, there was something in the way she said it, like she wasn't entirely sure herself. I forced a laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, I guess if I start hearing whispers, I'll let you know." Claire smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, do that." We finished our coffee and chatted about normal stuff, work, favorite TV shows, places to eat in the neighborhood. But the whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about Dave, the guy who disappeared. I kept telling myself it was just an odd coincidence. There had to be a logical explanation. People leave apartments all the time. Still, as I walked back to my own place that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Claire's story than she was telling me. And as I unlocked my door and stepped into the dimly lit hallway, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing behind me. But, of course, there was nothing there. Just the quiet hum of the old building and the soft creaking of the wooden floors as I made my way to bed. Even then, though, I couldn't help but feel like the apartment was waiting for something. Or someone. A few nights later, I was up late working on some paperwork. I had the TV on for background noise, trying to keep my mind busy and not think too much about Claire's story. It was just after 11 p.m. when I heard it for the first time, a knock at the door. It wasn't loud, more like a soft, deliberate tap. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. That's weird, I muttered to myself. Who will be knocking this late? I stood up and walked over to the door, half expecting to see Claire. Maybe she needed something or wanted to hang out. But when I checked the peephole, there was no one there. The hallway was empty. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, figuring I'd just imagined it. But as I turned to walk back to my desk, the knock came again, this time louder. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside the apartment. I froze, every hair on the back of my neck standing on end. No way, I whispered under my breath. It had to be my imagination. There was no way someone could be inside the apartment. I had locked the door behind me, and there were no signs of anyone getting in. But that knocking, it was clear, unmistakable, and it seemed to be coming from the wall just beyond my living room. I walked slowly through the apartment, my feet moving cautiously over the creaky wooden floors. I checked the kitchen, the bathroom, even the closet. Nothing. There was no one there. But as I stood in the middle of my apartment, the knock came again, louder now, and this time it sounded like it was coming from the walls themselves. I pressed my ear to the cold plaster, listening closely. At first, it was just silence. But then, from somewhere deep within the walls, I heard something, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking from the other side. What the hell? I muttered, stepping back from the wall. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath was coming in short, shallow bursts. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run out of the apartment and never come back, but the other part of me refused to believe that anything supernatural could be happening. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just the pipes or some weird noise from the old building. I walked back to the living room, trying to shake off the unease. I grabbed my phone, thinking maybe I should text Claire, but then I stopped myself. I didn't want to sound like an idiot. If she hadn't heard anything strange herself, she'd probably think I was losing it. But just as I was about to sit back down at my desk, the knock came again, this time right behind me. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. Okay, this is getting ridiculous, I said out loud, trying to calm myself down. I grabbed my keys and jacket and decided to take a walk, clear my head. The apartment felt suffocating all of a sudden, like the walls were closing in on me. I needed air, and I needed to get out of there, at least for a little while. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt a little better. The cold night air from the open window at the end of the corridor hit my face, grounding me in reality. I took the stairs down to the lobby and stepped outside. The street was quiet, the dim streetlights casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I started walking, not really sure where I was going, just knowing I needed to move. After about 10 minutes, I found myself standing in front of a 24-hour coffee shop. I went inside, ordered a coffee, and sat down at a table by the window. The place was mostly empty, except for a few people tapping away on laptops or scrolling through their phones. The normalcy of it all was a relief. For a while, I let myself get lost in the warmth of the coffee and the quiet hum of the cafe. But as the minutes ticked by, my mind kept drifting back to the apartment, to the knocking. It didn't make sense. The walls weren't thin enough for me to hear neighbors, and I hadn't noticed any pipes that would make that kind of noise. What was I hearing? I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. It was probably just stress. I'd been working long hours, adjusting to living alone. My mind was playing tricks on me, that's all. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, a gnawing feeling in my gut told me there was something more going on. Something I couldn't explain. After about an hour at the cafe, I headed back to the apartment, feeling a bit calmer but still uneasy. The walk back was quiet, almost too quiet. The streets seemed deserted, and the only sound was the crunch of my shoes on the pavement. When I reached the building, I hesitated for a moment before going inside. The lobby was as empty as ever. And as I climbed the stairs back to my floor, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the hallway was empty, and when I reached my apartment door, everything was as I'd left it. I stood in front of the door for a moment, taking a deep breath. Get it together, I told myself before unlocking the door and stepping inside. The apartment was dark and quiet, just as I'd left it. I flicked on the lights and looked around. Everything was normal. There was no sign of anything strange. No knocking, no footsteps, just silence. I locked the door behind me and stood in the living room for a moment, listening. Nothing. I let out a long breath, feeling a little foolish for getting so worked up. But just as I was starting to relax, the knock came again, this time from directly behind me. The knock behind me was so sudden, so loud, that I nearly jumped out of my skin. My heart pounded in my chest as I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there. But once again, there was nothing. The room was empty, just as it had been before. I stood there for a few moments, frozen, trying to process what was happening. The knocking wasn't my imagination. I knew that much now. But where was it coming from? Why did it seem like it was moving around the apartment? I didn't know what else to do, so I grabbed my phone and texted Claire. K, are you awake? Something really weird is happening in my apartment. Can I come over? I stared at the screen, waiting for a reply. I didn't want to sound like a complete lunatic, but at this point, I couldn't handle this alone. After a few agonizing minutes, my phone buzzed. Yes, sure. Come over. I grabbed my keys and headed across the hall to Claire's apartment. I felt a little embarrassed standing at her door, knowing how ridiculous this whole thing must sound. But Claire didn't seem surprised when she opened the door. In fact, she looked at me with an almost knowing expression, like she'd been expecting this. You okay? She asked, stepping aside to let me in. No, I admitted, stepping into the warm, familiar space of her apartment. I don't know how to explain it, but something's wrong in my place. There's this knocking sound, and it's not coming from outside or the hallway. It's like it's inside the walls. Claire closed the door behind me, her face serious. She motioned for me to sit down on the couch, and she sat across from me, her eyes studying my face as I tried to catch my breath. I didn't want to freak you out before, but since you've heard it, I guess I should tell you what I know, she said, her voice quieter now, like she was about to reveal some dark secret. I leaned forward, my pulse still racing from the adrenaline. What do you mean? Claire sighed and took a moment before speaking. The thing is, you're not the first person to deal with this. There's a reason why the apartment was vacant for so long before you moved in. People don't stay there for very long. I felt a chill creep up my spine. What are you talking about? Before you moved in, there was a guy named Dave who lived there. Nice enough guy, but he started having weird experiences pretty soon after moving in. Same as you. Hearing knocks, footsteps, and seeing things that didn't add up. At first, he thought it was just the building too, but it kept getting worse. He started losing sleep, acting paranoid, and kept telling me that someone was in the apartment with him, even though no one else was there. Did he ever find out what was causing it? I asked, leaning in closer. Claire shook her head slowly. Not really. He got obsessed with figuring it out, though. He thought the apartment was haunted or something. He even tried to talk to the landlord about it, but all Mr. Howard would say was that the building was old and things like that happen sometimes. I frowned, thinking about my brief encounters with Mr. Howard. He'd been polite, but distant, almost like he didn't want to talk to me much. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now it felt odd. So what happened to Dave? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Claire looked down at her hands. One day he just vanished. No goodbye, no moving truck, nothing. His apartment was left exactly how it was, like he just stepped out for a minute. But he never came back. I asked Mr. Howard about it, and he told me that Dave broke his lease and left in a hurry. But I don't believe that. Dave was terrified. He wouldn't have just left like that without telling anyone. A knot formed in my stomach. So, you think something happened to him? Something. In the apartment? Claire's eyes met mine, and for a moment, she looked genuinely scared. I don't know. All I know is that after he disappeared, the apartment stayed empty for a long time. Until you moved in. I leaned back on the couch, trying to process what she was telling me. Why didn't you tell me any of this before? I didn't want to scare you off, she admitted. Plus, part of me thought maybe it was all in Dave's head. But now that you're hearing the same things, I don't know. Maybe there's something wrong with that apartment. A heavy silence hung between us, the weight of Claire's words settling in. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew there was something strange about the apartment. The knocking, the footsteps, it all felt too real to be my imagination. I don't know what to do, I finally said, my voice shaky. I can't stay there if this keeps happening. Claire nodded, understanding. I get it. Maybe you should talk to Mr. Howard again. See if he'll let you break the lease. Or maybe you should try to find out more about the building. See if there's any history of strange things happening. I thought about that for a moment. The idea of digging into the history of the building sounded crazy, but at the same time, I needed answers. I couldn't just sit around waiting for the knocking to drive me insane like it had with Dave. Maybe I will, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what I hoped to find. Claire stood up and walked over to the kitchen, returning with a glass of water. Whatever you decide, just be careful. And if things get worse, don't hesitate to come over. I don't want you to go through this alone like Dave did. I nodded, grateful for her offer. The truth was I didn't want to be alone in that apartment anymore. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much the place was starting to get under my skin, to mess with my head. I needed to figure out what was happening, and fast. After thanking Claire for the water and the conversation, I headed back to my apartment, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the air felt heavier, like the apartment itself knew what Claire had told me. I stood in the middle of the living room, listening intently. For the first time that night, everything was silent. No knocks, no footsteps, no strange noises. Just the quiet hum of the building settling. But even in the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. That night, after talking to Claire, I tried to go to bed, but my mind wouldn't shut off. Every creak and groan of the apartment felt like a warning. And the more I thought about Dave and the knocking, the harder it was to convince myself that I was safe. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet, waiting for something, anything, to happen. It was around 3 a.m. when I finally started to drift off. My eyelids felt heavy, and the exhaustion from days of sleepless nights was catching up to me. But just as I was about to slip into unconsciousness, a noise pulled me back to reality. It was faint at first, like someone was dragging something across the floor in the room next to mine. I sat up in bed, my heart immediately racing. I told myself it was nothing, just the building, just the old pipes. But as I listened, the sound grew louder. It wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate, like someone was moving closer. My body tensed, every muscle on high alert. I slowly turned my head toward the door of my bedroom, the soft glow of the streetlight outside casting faint shadows on the floor. For a moment, there was nothing, just the quiet and the soft hum of the city outside. But then I saw it, a shadow, long and dark, standing just beyond the doorway. At first, I thought it might be a trick of the light, something my mind was conjuring up out of fear. But as I squinted into the darkness, I realized that the shadow was solid. It had form, depth. It wasn't just some vague shape. It was a person, tall, unmoving, standing at the foot of my bed. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I wanted to scream, to yell, but no sound came out. My body wouldn't respond. All I could do was stare at the shadow, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It didn't move. It just stood there, as if it was watching me. My brain raced with possibilities. Maybe it was someone who'd broken in. Maybe it was Claire playing some kind of messed up prank. But deep down, I knew that neither of those things were true. Whoever, or whatever, was standing there wasn't human. There was something wrong about the way the shadow stood, the way it loomed over me without making a sound. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping that when I opened them, the shadow would be gone. For a few seconds, I sat there, my body trembling, waiting for the nightmare to end. When I finally forced myself to open my eyes, the shadow had moved. It was closer now, standing just a few feet from my bed. I gasped, scrambling backward, nearly falling out of bed. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear anything else. The shadow was still there, standing, waiting. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't move. It just stayed there, as if it was waiting for something. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. One moment, it was standing in front of me, and the next, it vanished into the darkness, like it had never been there at all. I sat there in the silence, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My entire body was locked in place, fear gripping every part of me. What the hell had I just seen? I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I couldn't. I sat on the edge of the bed, my eyes darting around the room, waiting for the shadow to return. But it never did. The apartment was quiet, eerily so. Too quiet. When morning finally came, I felt like a zombie. My head was heavy, my body aching from the tension of the night. But as the sun rose and the light filtered into the apartment, some of the fear started to fade. It was easier to tell myself that what I'd seen was just a dream, a product of my overtired brain. Shadows don't just appear and disappear. They don't stand at the foot of your bed. I tried to convince myself of that as I made coffee. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. That shadow, the way it had stood there, so still, so silent. It felt real. Too real. I couldn't handle it anymore. I needed to talk to someone. I needed to figure out what was happening in this apartment before I lost my mind completely. I grabbed my phone and texted Claire. "Asterisk, can we talk? It's about last night. Something happened." Asterisk. It didn't take long for her to respond. Asterisk, come over. I'll make coffee. Asterisk. I didn't even bother to change out of my pajamas. I grabbed my keys and headed straight to Claire's apartment, the fear from the night before still clinging to me like a second skin. When she opened the door, she took one look at me and knew something was wrong. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I don't know what I saw," I admitted, sitting down on her couch. My hands were still trembling, and I wrapped them around the cup of coffee she handed me, trying to steady myself. But it was something. There was a shadow. In my apartment. It was just standing there, watching me. Claire's face went pale. She sat down across from me, her eyes wide with concern. "What do you mean a shadow? Are you sure it wasn't just the light playing tricks on you?" "I thought that at first," I said, shaking my head. "But it wasn't. It was... I don't know how to explain it. It was like a person, but not. And then it just disappeared." Claire was silent for a moment, her expression unreadable. "I've heard other people talk about things like that before," she finally said. "Not just in your apartment, but in this building. Weird things, shadows, noises, people disappearing." I swallowed hard, my stomach churning with unease. "What do you mean, people disappearing?" "Like Dave," she said softly, "and others before him. People just vanish. It's like the apartment takes them. I don't know how to explain it, but that's what it feels like. Like the building itself is alive, and it wants something from us." I shivered, the fear I'd been trying to suppress bubbling back to the surface. "What do we do?" Claire looked at me, her face pale and serious. "We get out, before it gets worse." I nodded, but deep down I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. Whatever was happening in this building, it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. When I first moved into the apartment, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It had this old, vintage charm that felt cozy, like something out of a movie. The rent was cheaper than anything else I'd seen in the area, and it was close to work. Everything seemed perfect. The landlord, an older guy named Mr. Howard, barely asked me any questions before handing me the keys. He seemed too eager to give me the place, almost like he couldn't wait to get rid of it. I shrugged it off at the time. Maybe he was just glad to rent it out quickly. I didn't think much of it as I moved in. The first day was all about unpacking, setting up my stuff, and getting things in order. By the time I was done, the sun was setting, casting a warm glow through the big windows. The place had an old-school vibe with creaky wooden floors and this kind of musty smell that wasn't unpleasant. Just a reminder that the building had been around for a long time. That night, I was buzzing with excitement. My first apartment on my own. No roommates, no parents, just me and my space. I settled into bed, the exhaustion from moving finally catching up with me. I was ready for a deep, uninterrupted sleep. But around 2 a.m., something woke me up. At first, I thought I was dreaming. I heard these faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, like someone was walking down the hall right outside my bedroom door. I lay there, frozen, trying to convince myself it was just the old building settling, maybe a neighbor coming home late. But the footsteps kept going closer until they stopped right outside my door. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. What the hell? I whispered to myself, straining to listen. Nothing, just silence. I got out of bed, hesitating before walking to the door. Every instinct told me to just ignore it, to go back to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I slowly turned the doorknob and peeked into the hallway. It was empty. Of course it was. I laughed at myself, feeling stupid for getting spooked so easily. Old building, I muttered. Everything creaks. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much after that. Every little noise had me on edge, even though I knew, logically, it had to be nothing. But still, there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind, this weird tension I couldn't shake. It felt like the apartment was watching me. I know that sounds ridiculous, but that's the only way I can describe it. Like the walls were too close, the air too still. By the time morning rolled around, I tried to push the whole thing out of my mind. First night jitters, I told myself. You're just getting used to the place. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Something about the apartment just didn't feel right. And that was only the beginning. The day after I saw the shadow, everything felt different. My apartment didn't just feel eerie anymore. It felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The air seemed heavier, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me slowly. Every little noise made me jump, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting the shadow to appear again. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined that shadow standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment much longer. Claire had been right. Something was wrong with this place, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it wanted. That afternoon, I decided to confront the landlord. If anyone knew what was going on, it had to be him. I'd always thought Mr. Howard seemed strange, too eager to rent me the place, too quick to brush off any questions about the building. There was something he wasn't telling me, and I needed answers. I knocked on his office door, located in the basement of the building. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and Mr. Howard appeared. He looked as unbothered as ever, his face blank and unreadable. "Ah, it's you," he said, not sounding particularly surprised to see me. "Is there something wrong with the apartment?" "Yeah," I said, feeling my frustration bubble up. "Something's definitely wrong. I've been hearing weird noises, seeing things, and I'm not the first one, am I?" Mr. Howard's expression didn't change. He just stared at me, his pale blue eyes unsettlingly calm. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said in his usual monotone. "Old buildings make noises. People see things when they're tired. It's not unusual." "Cut the crap," I snapped, losing my patience. "I know about Dave. Claire told me. He didn't just leave, did he? He disappeared. And something is happening in that apartment. You know it, and you're not telling me." Mr. Howard sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. For the first time, he looked a little uncomfortable. "Look, some tenants get spooked. Old buildings have stories, and people like to make up things that aren't there. But I assure you, there's nothing wrong with the apartment." His words didn't convince me. I knew he was lying, or at the very least, hiding something. "What happened to Dave?" I demanded. "Why did he leave all his stuff behind? Why hasn't anyone seen him since?" Mr. Howard hesitated, his eyes shifting away from mine for just a second. "Left in a hurry. That's all I know. People get scared and move out. It happens. That's not good enough," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Something's wrong with this place, and I'm not going to wait around to find out what it is." Without another word, I turned and stormed out of his office, my frustration boiling over. I knew I wasn't going to get any more answers from him. Whatever was happening in the apartment, he wasn't going to admit it. Maybe he didn't even fully understand it himself. But I was done. I wasn't going to stick around and become the next tenant to disappear. That night, I decided to pack my things. I didn't care about the lease or what Mr. Howard would say. I just needed to get out. As I started throwing clothes into a suitcase, I heard a knock on the door. My heart jumped into my throat. Not again. But then I heard Claire's voice from the other side. "Hey, it's me. Can I come in?" I rushed to open the door, relief flooding through me when I saw her standing there. She looked tense, like she hadn't slept any better than I had. "I wanted to check on you," she said, stepping inside. "I couldn't stop thinking about what you said yesterday. About the shadow." "Yeah," I muttered, gesturing to my half-packed suitcase. "I'm getting out of here." Claire nodded, but she didn't look surprised. "I think that's the right call. I've been doing some digging, and I found out that Dave wasn't the only one who disappeared. There have been others, too. People who lived in this building, who just vanished without a trace." "What do you mean, others?" I asked, my voice tight. Claire sat down on the couch, pulling out her phone. "I spent hours online last night, looking up old records, news articles, anything I could find. It turns out this building has a bit of a reputation. Tenants disappearing, strange occurrences. The police don't have any answers. They always chalk it up to people leaving town, skipping out on rent. But the stories are all the same. People hear things, see things, and then they're gone." A cold shiver ran down my spine. "And the landlord? He's got to know, right?" Claire shrugged. "He's been here for years, so I'd assume he knows something. But if he does, he's not talking. He probably just wants to keep renting the place out, and doesn't want anyone getting spooked." I sat down next to her, my mind racing. "So, what do we do? I mean, we can't just let this happen to someone else." Claire looked at me, her expression serious. "I don't think we have a choice. We can't fix whatever's going on here. All we can do is get out and warn people. If the apartment takes someone, well, there's not much anyone can do about it." I stared at her, my heart pounding. "You think the apartment takes people?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I do. I know it sounds crazy, but think about it. The knocking, the footsteps, the shadow you saw. It's like the apartment is trying to wear people down, make them vulnerable. And when it's ready, they disappear." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down I knew she was right. The apartment wasn't just haunted, it was dangerous. Whatever was happening here, it was beyond anything I could explain. And I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it wanted from me. "Let's get out of here," I said, standing up and grabbing my suitcase. "Now!" Claire nodded and got to her feet. "I'll help you pack. We'll get out tonight." We worked quickly, throwing the rest of my things into bags, barely speaking as the tension in the room grew thicker. The entire time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the apartment knew we were leaving and didn't want to let us go. Just as we were finishing up, there was a loud knock on the door. Both Claire and I froze, our eyes locking in terror. I slowly walked toward the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. I pulled it open, expecting to see Mr. Howard standing there, or worse, something else entirely. But the hallway was empty. No one was there. My blood ran cold. "Claire!" But when I turned around, Claire was gone. Her bag was still on the floor, her jacket draped over the back of the couch, but she wasn't there. I searched the apartment, calling her name, but she had vanished. Just like Dave, just like the others. I stood there, trembling, as the realization hit me. The apartment had taken her. I stood there in stunned silence, staring at the empty space where Claire had been just moments before. The apartment felt colder now, as if all the warmth had drained from the room the second she disappeared. My hands shook uncontrollably, and my mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. "Claire!" I called again, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen, every corner of the apartment, but she was gone, completely, utterly gone. It was like she had been swallowed by the walls, like the apartment had erased her from existence. Her phone was still sitting on the coffee table. The screen lit up with a half-finished text message she had been writing to someone. There was no way she could have just left. The front door was still locked, and there was no sound of footsteps or movement in the hallway. I backed away from her phone, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The room felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I could almost hear the apartment breathing around me, the creaking walls closing in, as if they were alive and watching. Suddenly it all made sense. The knocking, the footsteps, the shadow, it wasn't just a haunting. The apartment itself was doing this. It was taking people, Dave hadn't left. Claire hadn't just walked away. They had been absorbed, swallowed by whatever dark force lived within these walls. I sank down onto the couch, my legs unable to hold me up any longer. The truth weighed on me like a heavy stone in my chest. I had to get out. Asterisk now star. There was no more time to waste. The longer I stayed here, the closer I came to disappearing just like Claire. The apartment would take me too. It was only a matter of time. Grabbing my suitcase, I rushed toward the door. But as I reached for the handle, a deep, echoing knock rang out from the walls. This time it wasn't just one knock. It was multiple, loud, insistent, as if something inside the walls was trying to get my attention, trying to stop me from leaving. I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob, every muscle in my body locked in place. The knocking grew louder, faster, like someone or something was frantically trying to reach me from the other side. "Don't listen," I whispered to myself, squeezing my eyes shut. "It's not real. It's just the apartment messing with you." But then, through the knocking, I heard it, Claire's voice. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. "Help me," she whispered. "Please, I'm here." My blood ran cold. "Claire." The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then her voice came again, clearer this time, as if she were standing right on the other side of the wall. "Help me. I'm here. Please don't leave me." I didn't know what to do. I could feel the panic rising in my chest, my hands trembling as I stood there, torn between the urge to run and the desperate need to help her. But how could I help her? She wasn't here. She had vanished, just like everyone else. And now the apartment was using her voice to lure me in, to trap me, the same way it had trapped her. "Please don't leave me," Claire's voice repeated, this time louder. More insistent. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. I knew it wasn't really her. I knew that. But the sound of her voice, it was so convincing, so real. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my heart couldn't let go of the possibility that she might still be in there somewhere, trapped, waiting for me to find her. I hesitated for what felt like an eternity, standing there in the dim hallway, the air heavy with the apartment's presence. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, the ceiling pressing down, the shadows shifting in the corners of my vision. The whole building seemed alive, and it was waiting for me to make a decision. Finally, I forced myself to move. I grabbed my suitcase and turned back toward the door, my heart pounding in my ears. But just as I reached for the knob again, the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then the apartment was plunged into total darkness. I gasped, stumbling backward as I fumbled for my phone. The faint glow of the screen was the only light I had now, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. The air had grown icy, and my breath came out in ragged, visible puffs. And then I heard it again, Claire's voice. But this time it wasn't pleading or begging for help. It was whispering, low and soft, right in my ear. "Stay with me. Don't go. You belong here." I whipped around, my pulse racing, but there was no one there. Nothing but darkness and the oppressive silence pressing in on me from every direction. "No," I muttered under my breath, my voice shaking. "No, I don't belong here." I lunged for the door, my fingers grasping the cold metal of the doorknob, desperate to escape. But it wouldn't budge. The door was stuck or locked or something. I twisted the knob harder, pulling with all my strength, but it felt like the door was glued in place, refusing to open. Panic surged through me as I tugged and pulled, my breath coming faster now. "Come on," I shouted, slamming my hand against the door. "Let me out." But the door stayed firmly shut. I could feel the apartment tightening around me, the darkness closing in, the walls creeping closer, like it was trying to swallow me whole. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, the shadow. It was back, standing in the far corner of the room, watching me. It was taller this time, darker, more defined. I could almost make out the shape of a person, but it wasn't human. It was wrong, distorted, like something pretending to be human, but failing. I backed away, my heart slamming against my ribs as the shadow moved closer, gliding toward me without a sound. It didn't have a face, but I could feel its eyes on me, feel its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. "No," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the shadow kept coming, inching closer, growing larger, until it was towering over me. I pressed myself against the door, my body trembling with fear as it loomed above me, blocking out everything else. And then, just as it was about to reach me, it stopped. The air around me seemed to still, the apartment holding its breath, waiting. "You can't leave," a voice whispered, though it didn't sound like Claire anymore. It was darker, deeper, more sinister. "This is where you belong." I closed my eyes, shaking my head, refusing to accept it. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't leaving this apartment, because the apartment wasn't just a place. It was a trap, and I had walked right into it. Just like Dave, just like Claire, just like everyone else. The apartment had me now, and it wasn't going to let me go.